The Antarctic continent is the home of nature in her wildest and most relentless moods, and it is there that the hurricane and the blizzard are born. Though much larger than Europe, that vast continent has never been inhabited by man. It is utterly devoid of vegetation, and no land animals of any kind exist there. The only living creatures are those that come out of the sea, and the heart of that ice-bound wilderness has been trodden by only 10 men since the creation. It is the uttermost end of the earth, 90 south, the South Pole. With the return of the sun, I got to work with the movie cameras again. They had to be hauled about on a sledge. Photographing was very cold work, and though hands were protected with several pairs of woolen gloves and thick fur mitts, fingers sometimes got frostbitten. Occasionally we had a football match to keep us fit. The teams coming out of the hut are first Mr. Debenham, Mr. Wright, Mr. Day, Dr. Atkinson, Captain Oates, Dr. Wilson, Lieutenant Bowers, Mr. Taylor, Mr. Mears, Hooper, Lieutenant Evans, Mr. Nelson, Lieutenant Grant, Mr. Jerry Gallard with a cold nose, Lashley, Green, Dimitri, Petty Officer Evans, Cohane, and lastly Captain Scott with the ball, who kicks off. Dr. Wilson and Lieutenant Bowers playing full-back. This game was played on the frozen sea, thousands of miles nearer the South Pole than any other football game ever contested. The hard frozen snow on the ice gives a firm footing. The long shadows show how low the sun was at the time. It was midday, but the sun was only just above the horizon. And the temperature was nearly 50 degrees below zero, which was a bit rough on the photographer. The ponies had to be exercised too. They were brought out of the stables each day for a run by those who later led them on the journey to the pole. Dr. Wilson always worked with Nobby, the best looking of all our shaggy little Russian broncos. Captain Scott always kept a watchful eye on the transport animals on which so much depended, and he often had a friendly word and pat for the ponies. Lieutenant Bowers with Victor. Bowers was the smallest member of the expedition, but he was one of the hardiest men who ever went to the polar regions. And Petty Officer Evans, the strong man of the expedition, with Snatcher. 5 men, Captain Scott, Dr. Wilson, Captain Oates, Lieutenant Bowers, and Petty Officer Evans, pressed onwards to the goal, which was now distant only 150 miles. It is interesting to see something of the routine they had to go through twice each day when they pitched their camp. This and the following scenes were taken a few days before the pole journey began, but they show exactly how the party camped each night. The routine was always the same. First to lay the floor cloth of the tent, and on top of that, place the sleeping bags. Next, they spread the tent poles, which are solid bamboo, very light and strong. Nothing heavy can be taken on a sledging journey, as everything must give way to food. Captain Scott is adjusting the tent poles whilst Dr. Wilson and Petty Officer Evans spread the cover, which is made of a very light windproof material. The great thing in these regions is to keep out the wind. Then they ballast the tent down by placing blocks of snow on the valance. Dr. Wilson trims the cover, whilst Captain Scott brings blocks of snow. And a tent well pitched like this sheds the wind so effectively that it will withstand almost any blizzard. Although the tent looks so small, 5 men were able to camp in it. Having made everything shipshape, they go inside, close the opening to make it weatherproof, and immediately prepare for the evening meal. On the right is Captain Scott. Next, Dr. Wilson, Lieutenant Bowers, and Petty Officer Evans. Evans is cook for the day, and he is getting the stove ready. They take the cooking in turn. Whilst waiting with prodigious appetites for the meal, they change their footgear, because socks get damp from tramping all day in the snow, and their feet would be frostbitten when they stopped, if they did not change. If they wore 4 or 5 pairs of thick woolen socks and Norwegian fur moccasins. The meal is nearly ready, and they are eagerly anticipating their pemmican hoosh, special biscuits, butter, cocoa, and sugar. Pemmican hoosh is a thick soup made of dried beef, and that was their fare day after day. The same old thing, pemmican, biscuits, and cocoa. When we were pulling sledges all day long in the Antarctic, in zero weather, the principal subject of conversation was always food. There was only one thing which seemed really worth talking about, and that was food. We talked about meals had in the past and planned for meals in the future, and we sometimes indulged in regrets about second helpings refused years ago. I recall a remark which Captain Scott made at this time. He turned to the others and said, "What fun it will be when we are home again and see this at the cinema." As soon as the meal is finished, they clean up the tent and make ready to get into their sleeping bags. After slogging 12 hours pulling the heavy sledge, they are dog-tired, and their one thought now is rest. The sleeping bags are made of reindeer fur, very thick and warm. But in such fearfully low temperatures, 70, 80, and 90 degrees of frost, as we're experienced on the pole journey, it is not possible to keep warm in anything, and the occupants lay shivering in their bags all night. There are only 4 men here, but on the pole journey, 5 men slept in this same tent. The bags were easy enough to get into at this time, but a few weeks later they became so thickly coated inside with ice that sometimes it took nearly an hour to get into them, for the ice had to be thawed gradually by the warmth of their bodies. When they had got well down into the bags, they pulled the flaps over their heads, because if they left hands or faces exposed, they would certainly get badly frostbitten. Then they wriggled close together to get all possible warmth. Each morning they turned out of the tent, packed the sledge, and got underway again, immediately after their morning meal.